We all know that famous titles like Minecraft, Rocket League, Lethal Company, and most recently Palworld have been huge hits with the general gamer population. Although all of these games have pretty vast differences between each other, there is one thing they all have in common. They are all indie games. For those of you that may not know, something being an indie game just means that they were made by an independent company or smaller development team without the financial and technical support of a large game publisher. Even though they have less resources than larger companies, they seem to be making games that are just as good, if not better. In this video, we are going to explore the popularity of these games and how exactly they stack up to the ultra popular game titles with the never-ending sequels. First up, let's briefly review the games I mentioned at the start of the video. Minecraft, made by Mojang, is currently the most popular indie game with over 300 million copies sold, which is also the highest selling game worldwide. Lethal Company, which came out last year, sold over 10 million copies already, and was made by a singular person named Zeekers. This game sold about the same amount that Starfield did, which came out a month before Lethal Company. Then there's Palworld, which came out in January of this year, sold over 25 million units, and was only the second game made by Pocket Pair Inc. This would place Palworld in the top 50 best-selling video games worldwide. Lastly, Rocket League sold over 10.5 million copies and was made by Psyonix. This last example of Rocket League is a bit different though. Similar to the situation with Fall Guys, both games were independently made, however, both were bought out by Epic Games. Looking through forums and different reviews online show that these games have gotten worse since Epic's acquisition, which may show that larger companies truly don't know what their consumers want. Some say that Epic saved Fall Guys by making it free to play, but with a lack of content updates, the installment of more microtransactions, and occasional gameplay issues, the communities for these two games generally appear to be dissatisfied. Another glaring example of indie games potentially being the better games is Among Us. Although not a new game at the time, Among Us took the world by storm when the pandemic hit, where seemingly every person you knew was playing this game. This just shows how much of a disadvantage indie companies have, and that they don't have the resources to market their games as much as bigger companies. Needing a pandemic and having people get bored enough to look for new games should not be the reason games like this finally get a chance to shine, although in this case, the very rare circumstances may have benefited the game to get people playing it. Among Us was made by Innersloth, a company of 8 people that have only made a handful of games to date, who only started working on games full-time around the release of Among Us in 2018. Now, why do indie games seem to appeal to the masses so well? And why is a single person able to make a game better than an entire company can? Well, there may be a few reasons here. First, let's look at the larger companies' perspectives. Many companies often have established games that have been successful, such as Halo by Bungie or Baldur's Gate by BioWare. Most of these companies focus on sequels, remakes, and updates to capitalize on what seems to work. It takes a significant amount of time and money to create games at scale, so the ability to de-risk the investment by doing what has already worked encourages the thought that it will work again. The problem here is that they lose sight of what made their games popular in the first place, and just try to get the next game out to make a quick buck and please the shareholders and management. Sure, they try to add in different features to make their games a little different, but in the big picture, a lot of these series of games are just rinse and repeat. They know that people will buy their games regardless because of their popularity, which means that creating these games are generally risk-free. Even if some games perform poorly, these companies can afford it because they have money to sit back on, which can't really be said for indie developers. And even then, they will throw in microtransactions to make even more money off of overpriced cosmetics. Then they're ready to move on to the next game. Too many large companies seem to be utilizing this strategy, and many people are getting sick of it. Now looking at the indie side, these games are often praised for their innovative gameplay, creative storytelling, and the unique experiences they offer. The first thing to identify here is that they don't have much room for error. Indie developers don't often have extra resources to fall back on like larger companies, so they have to make sure they do everything right and listen to the consumers' feedback as much as possible. They not only need to do this to make sure their game is successful, they need to do this just to keep their games alive in some instances. This obviously doesn't apply to the games that I've listed earlier due to the amount of sales they have, but they only achieve their success by listening to their fans and capitalizing on their innovative ideas. Looking at Lethal Company as an example, we can see that the lone creator has a passion for their game and continues to feed additional content to the fans without the need for microtransactions. I personally find it quite interesting how this retains a huge player base and that larger companies can't clue in on this. The next thing we'll do is look at some stats, because how can you debate on something without some fun stats? Based on Steam alone, indie games have had an unprecedented impact, with 5 of the top 10 highest grossing games so far this year having been classified as indie. These games include Palworld, Grand Blue, Last Epoch, Lethal Company, and Enshrouded. The dominance of indie games in 2024 is not an accidental occurrence of release timing, but rather the culmination of a decade-long trend where indie games have steadily increased their market share. The next thing to look at is revenue. Strictly looking at the sales and disregarding any microtransactions, Indie games are already dominating the Steam charts and accounting for the largest portion of Steam revenue in recent years. With more and more indie games being released, their share of the marketplace has steadily gone up every year, along with the percentage of revenue that has gone into indie games. This may be happening here because there is a general belief that the shift towards indie games reflects the broader dissatisfaction that some gamers feel towards the lack of innovation in the AAA sector. In 2024 so far, indie games have accounted for approximately 47% of revenue among all games, up from around 25% just 6 years ago in 2018. Indie games also account for about 43% of games that made over $10 million in revenue, which is up from about 35% in 2018. Now, just by looking at sales, you can't exactly see how much players actually liked these games, so we'll look at the ratings between them. AAA games are expected to be high quality due to the massive teams that work on these games, so you'd expect their ratings to be pretty high. Back in 2018, AAA games had an average rating of about 78%, with staggering results over the past few years. In 2023, they finished with an average rating of about 74%. Indie games, on the other hand, would probably make you think that their ratings are low based on the lack of resources and small team sizes. While that may have been true about a decade ago, back in 2018, indie games averaged a 67% rating and has pretty much only gone up since then. In 2024, they narrowed the gap between themselves and AAA games, achieving an average rating of 72%, separating the two by only 2%. Although we can give props to the independent developers and give the finger to greedy corporations from the results of these trends, there's one thing we have to ask. How are independent developers able to keep up? Well, the answer is quite simple actually. Other than the obvious, they listen to their fans or they care about their game and not the money, the answer is in the development tools. Unreal Engine and Unity help developers avoid building an engine from scratch each time they want to make a game. This extends to various aspects of game development, from multiplayer server management to user analytics, enabling developers to outsource and automate many processes and instead focus on creativity, fun mechanics, and storytelling. This also means that the barrier to entry is lower, allowing more people to create more games, which will lead to a variety of creativity and innovativeness, sending more indie games to the top of the charts. These tools have also consistently decreased costs and reduced the time and resources required to make a game, which allows for more focus on quality. And they're only going to get better too with the advancement of AI. Overall, I think that indie games will continue to make a push for the top of the charts, and eventually be the better selling games between them and the AAA titles. I also do believe there's an obvious shifting preference toward unique gameplay experiences over the traditional sequel-driven AAA games. This may be the biggest year for indie game developers yet, but we'll have to wait and find out about that. They did start off pretty strong this year so far after all. But anyway, let me know what you think about all this in the comments, and let me know what you think the gaming industry will look like in a few years, and whether it's going to be dominated by AAA titles or indie games. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'm out.